Columbia Pictures is an American film production and distribution company. The company was founded on June 19, 1918 as Cohn-Brandt-Cohn CBC Film Sales Corporation in New York City, United States, and on January 10, 1924 as Columbia Pictures in Los Angeles, United States by Harry and Jack Cohn Joe Brandt, and to this very day the company is still alive and healthy. So, how did it become so popular? Let's find out. Early years as CBC. The studio was founded on June 19, 1918 as Cohn-Brandt-Cohn CBC Film Sales by brothers Jack and Harry Cohn and Jack's best friend Joe Brandt, and released its first feature film, More to be Pitied Than Scorned, on August 20th, 1922. The film, with a budget of $20,000, was a success, bringing in $130,000 in revenue for the company. Brandt was president of CBC Film Sales, handling sales, marketing, and distribution from New York, along with Jack Cohn, while Harry Cohn ran a production in Hollywood. The studio's early productions were low-budget short subjects. Screen Snapshots, The Hallroom Boys, The Vaudeville Duo of Edward Flanagan and Neely Edwards, and the Chaplin imitator Billy West. The startup CBC leased space in a Poverty Row studio in Hollywood, famously low-rent Gower Street. Among Hollywood's elite, the studio's small-time reputation led some to joke that CBC stood for corned beef and cabbage. Reorganization and new name. CBC was reorganized as Columbia Pictures Corporation by brothers Harry and Jack Cohn and best friend Joe Brandt on January 10, 1924. Harry Cohn became president in 1932 and remained head of production as well, thus concentrating enormous power in his hands. He would run Columbia for a total of 34 years, one of the longest tenures of any studio chief. Warner Brothers' Jack L. Warner was head of production or CEO longer, but did not become CEO until 1956. Even in an industry rife with nepotism, Columbia was particularly notorious for having a number of Harry and Jack's relatives in high positions. Humorist Robert Benchley called the Pine Tree Studio because it has so many Cohns. Brandt, eventually tired of dealing with the Cohn brothers, and in 1932 sold his one-third stake to Jack and Harry Cohn, who took over from him as president. Columbia's product line consisted mostly of moderately budgeted features and short subjects, including comedies, sports films, various serials, and cartoons. Columbia gradually moved into production of higher budget fare, eventually joining the second tier of Hollywood studios along with United Artists and Universal. Like United Artists and Universal, Columbia was a horizontally integrated company. It controlled production and distribution. It did not own any theaters. Helping Columbia's climb was the arrival of an ambitious director, Frank Capra. Between 1927 and 1939, Capra constantly pushed Cohn for better material and bigger budgets. A string of hits he directed in the early and mid-1930s solidified Columbia's status as a major studio. In particular, It Happened One Night, which nearly swept the 1934 Oscars, put Columbia on the map. Until then, Columbia's business had depended on theater owners willing to take its films, since it did not have a theater network of its own. Other Capra-directed hits followed, including the original version of Lost Horizon in 1937, with Roland Colman and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939, which made James Stewart a major star. In 1933, Columbia hired Robert Calick to be its chief fashion and women's costume designer. He was the first contract costume designer hired by the studio, and he established the studio's wardrobe department. Calick's employment, in turn, convinced leading actresses that Columbia Pictures intended to invest in their careers. In 1938, the addition of B.B. Conné as vice president would produce Charles Vidor's Those High Gray Walls in 1939 and The Lady in Question in 1940, the first joint film of Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford. Kahane would later become president of Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in 1959 until his death a year later. Columbia could not afford to keep a huge roster of contract stars, so John Cohn usually borrowed them from other studios. At Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the industry's most prestigious studio, Columbia was nicknamed Siberia, as Louis B. Mayer would use the loan-out to Columbia as a way to punish his least-obedient signings. In the 1930s, Columbia signed Jean Arthur to a long-term contract, and after the whole town's talking in 1935, Arthur became a major comedy star. Anne Souther's career was launched when Columbia signed her to a contract in 1936. Cary Grant signed a contract in 1937, and soon after it was altered to a non-exclusive contract shared with RKO. Many theaters relied on westerns to attract big weekend audiences, and Columbia always recognized this market. Its first cowboy star was Buck Jones, who signed with Columbia in 1930 for a fraction of his former big studio salary. Over the next 2 decades, Columbia released scores of outdoor adventures with Jones, Tim McCoy, Ken Maynard, Chuck Luden, Bob Allen, Robert Tex Allen, Russell Hayden, Tex Ritter, Ken Curtis, and Gene Autry. Columbia's most popular cowboy was Charles Starrett, who signed with Columbia in 1935 and starred in 131 Western features over 17 years. Short subjects. At Harry Cohn's insistence, the studio signed the Three Stooges in 1934. Rejected by MGM, which kept straight man Ted Healy but let the Stooges go, the Stooges made 190 shorts for Columbia between 1934 and 1957. Columbia's short subject department employed many famous comedians, including Buster Keaton, Charlie Chase, Harry Langdon, Andy Clyde, and Hugh Hubert. Almost 400 of Columbia's 529 two-reel comedies were released to television between 1958 and 1961. To date, all of the Stooges, Keaton, Charlie Chase, Shemp Howard, Joe Bezer, and Joe DeRita subjects have been released to home video. Columbia incorporated animation into its studio in 1929, distributing Crazy Cat cartoons, taking over from Paramount. The following year, Columbia took over distribution of the Mickey Mouse series from Celebrity Productions until 1932. In 1933, the Mint Studio was re-established under the Screen Gems brand. Columbia's leading cartoon series were Crazy Cat, Scrappy, The Fox and the Crow, very briefly, Lil Abner. Screen Gems was the last major cartoon studio to produce black and white cartoons, producing them until 1946. That same year, Screen Gems shut down but had completed enough cartoons for the studio to release until 1949. In 1948, Columbia agreed to release animated shorts from United Productions of America. These new shorts were more sophisticated than Columbia's older cartoons, and many won critical praise and industry awards. In 1957, 2 years before the UPA deal was terminated, Columbia distributed the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, including Loopy-de-Loop from 1959 to 1965, which was Columbia's final theatrical cartoon series. In 1967, the Hanna-Barbera deal expired and was not renewed. According to Bob Thomas's book, King Cohn, studio chief Harry Cohn always placed a high priority on serials. Beginning in 1937, Columbia entered the lucrative serial market and kept making these weekly episodic adventures until 1956, after other studios had discontinued them. The most famous Columbia serials are based on comic strip or radio characters. Mandrake the Magician in 1939, The Shadow in 1940, Terry and the Pirates in 1940, Captain Midnight in 1942, The Phantom in 1943, Batman in 1943, and the especially successful Superman in 1948, among many others. Columbia also produced musical shorts, sports reels, usually narrated by sportscaster Bill Stern, and travelogues. Its Screen Snapshot series showed behind-the-scenes footage of Hollywood stars was a Columbia perennial that the studio had been releasing since the silent movie days. Producer-director Ralph Staub kept the series going until 1958. 1940s. In the 1940s, propelled in the part by the surge in audiences for their films during the war, the studio also benefited from the popularity of its biggest star, Rita Hayworth. Columbia maintained a long list of contractees well into the 1950s. Glenn Ford, Penny Singleton, William Holden, Judy Holliday, The Three Stooges, Ann Miller, Evelyn Keyes, Ann Dorian, Jack Lemmon, Cleo Moore, Barbara Hale, Adil Jurgens, Larry Parks, Arthur Lake, Lucille Ball, Kerwin Matthews, and Kim Novak. Harry Cohn monitored the budgets of his films, and the studio got the maximum use of its costly sets, costumes, and props by reusing them in other films. Many of Columbia's low-budget B pictures and short subjects have an expensive look, thanks to Columbia's efficient recycling policy. Cohn was reluctant to spend lavish sums on even his most important pictures, and it was not until 1943 that he agreed to use 3-strip Technicolor in a live-action feature. Columbia was the last major studio to employ the expensive color process. Columbia's first Technicolor feature was the western The Desperados, starring Randolph Scott and Glenn Ford. Cohn quickly used Technicolor again for CoverGirl, a Hayworth vehicle that instantly was a smash hit, released in 1944, and the fanciful biography of Frederick Chopin, A Song to Remember with Cornel Wilde, released in 1945. Another biopic, 1946's The Jolson Story with Larry Parks and Evelyn Keyes, was started in a black and white, but when Cohn saw how well the project was proceeding, he scrapped the footage and insisted on filming in Technicolor. In 1948, the United States versus Paramount Pictures Incorporated antitrust decision forced Hollywood motion picture companies to divest themselves of the theater chains that they owned. Since Columbia did not own any theaters, it was not on equal terms with the largest studios, and soon replaced RKO on the list of the Big Five studios. Screen Gems. In 1946, Columbia dropped the Screen Gems brand from its cartoon line, but retained the Screen Gems name for various ancillary activities, including a 16mm film rental agency and a TV commercial production company. On November 8, 1948, Columbia adopted the Screen Gems name for its television production subsidiary when the studio acquired Pioneer Telefilms, a television commercial company founded by Jack Cohn's son Ralph. Pioneer had been founded in 1947 and was later reorganized as the Screen Gems. The studio opened its doors for business in New York on April 15, 1949. By 1951, Screen Gems became a full-fledged television studio and became a major producer of situation comedies for TV, beginning with Father Knows Best and followed by The Donna Red Show, The Partridge Family, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, and The Monkees. On July 1, 1956, studio veteran Ivring Briskin stepped down as manager of Columbia Pictures and formed his own production company, Briskin Productions Incorporated, to release series through Screen Gems and supervise all of its productions. On December 10th, Screen Gems expanded into television syndication by acquiring High Go Television Films, aka Serials Incorporated, and its affiliated company, United Television Films Incorporated. High Go Television Films was founded in 1951 by Jerome Hams, who also acquired United Television Films in 1955, and in 1955 that was also founded by Archie Mayers. In 1957, 2 years before its parent company Columbia dropped UPA, Screen Gems entered a distribution deal with Hanna-Barbera Productions, which produced classic TV cartoon shows as The Flintstones, Rough and Ready, The Huckleberry Hound Show, Yogi Bear, Johnny Quest, The Jetsons, and other. Screen Gems were distributed until 1967 when Hanna-Barbera was sold to Taft Broadcasting. In 1960, the cartoon studio became a publicly traded company under the Screen Gem name, under the name Screen Gems Incorporated when Columbia spun off an 18% stake. 1950s. By 1950, Columbia had discontinued most of its popular series films: Boston, Blackie, Blondie, The Lone Wolf, The Crime Doctor, Rusty, etc. Only Jungle Jim, launched by producer Sam Kratzman in 1949, kept going through 1955. Kratzman contributed greatly to Columbia's success by producing dozens of topical feature films, including crime dramas, science fiction stories, and rock and roll musicals. Columbia kept making serials until 1956 and 2 reel comedies until 1957, after other studios had abandoned them. As the larger studios declined in the 1950s, Columbia's position improved. This was largely because it did not suffer from the massive loss of income that other major studios suffered from the loss of their theaters, well over 90% in some cases. Columbia continued to produce 40-plus pictures a year, offering productions that often broke ground and kept audiences coming to theaters, such as its adaptation of the controversial James Jones novel From Here to Eternity in 1953, The Waterfront in 1954, and The Bridge of the River Kwai in 1957, with William Holden and Alec Guinness, all of which won the Best Picture Oscar, as well as the free adaptation of George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 in 1956. Columbia also released the Made in England Warwick films by producers Irving Allen and Albert R. Broccoli, as well as many films by producer Carl Foreman, who resided in England. Columbia also distributed some films made by Hammer. In December 1956, Jack Cohn, co-founder and executive vice president, died. In 1958, Columbia established its own record label, Colpix Records, initially run by Joni Taps, who headed Columbia's music department, and later Paul Wexler and Lester Sill. Colpix was active until 1966, when Columbia entered into a joint agreement with RCA Victor and discontinued Colpix in favor of its new label, Cold Gems Records. 1960s, after Harry Cohn's death. Shortly after closing their short subjects department, Columbia president Harry Cohn died of a heart attack in February 1958. His nephew Ralph Cohn died in 1959, ending almost 4 decades of family management. The new management was headed by Abe Schneider, who had joined the company as an office boy out of high school and become a director in 1929, rising through the financial side of the business. In 1963, Columbia acquired music publisher Alden Music. By the late 1960s, Columbia had an ambiguous identity, offering old-fashioned fare such as A Man for All Seasons and Oliver, along with the more contemporary Easy Rider and the Monkees. After turning down releasing Albert R. Broccoli's Eon Productions James Bond films, Columbia hired Broccoli's former partner Irving Allen to produce the Matt Helm series with Dean Martin. Columbia also produced a James Bond spoof, Casino Royale, in 1967 in conjunction with Charles K. Feldman, which held the adaptation rights for that novel. By 1966, the studio was suffering from box office failures, and takeover rumors began surfacing. Columbia was surviving solely on the profits made from Screen Gems, whose holdings also included radio and television stations. On December 23, 1968, Screen Gems merged with Columbia Pictures Corporation and became part of the newly formed Columbia Pictures Industries Incorporated for $24.5 million. Schneider was chairman of the holding company and Leo Jaffe president. Following the merger, in March 1969, CPI purchased Bell Records for $3.5 million, mainly in CPI stock, retaining Larry Uttal as label president. 1970s. Nearly bankrupt by the early 1970s, the studio was saved via a radical overhaul. The Gower Street Studios, now called Sunset Gower Studios, were sold and a new management team was brought in. In 1972, Columbia and Warner Brothers formed a partnership called the Burbank Studios, in which both companies shared the Warner Studio lot in Burbank. In 1971, Columbia Pictures established sheet music publisher Columbia Pictures Publications with Vice President and General Manager Frank J. Hackinson, who later became the president. In 1973, Allen and Company took a financial stake in Columbia Pictures Industries, and Alan Hirschfield was appointed CEO, succeeding Leo Jaffe, who became chairman. Stanley Schneider, son of Abe Schneider, who became honorary chairman before leaving the board in 1975, was replaced as head of the Columbia Pictures Studio by David Begelman, who reported to Hirschfield. Some years later, Begelman was involved in a check forging scandal that badly hurt the studio's image. On May 6, 1974, Columbia retired the Screen Gems name from television, renaming its television division Columbia Pictures Television. The name was suggested by David Gerber, who was then president of Columbia's television division. The same year, Columbia Pictures acquired Rastar Pictures, which included Rastar Productions, Rastar Features, and Rastar Television. Ray Stark then founded Rastar Films, a reincarnation of Rastar Pictures, which was acquired by Columbia Pictures in February 1980. Columbia Pictures also reorganized its music and record divisions. Clive Davies was hired as a record and music consultant by Columbia Pictures in 1974 and later became temporary president. Clive Davies was hired as a record and music consultant by Columbia Pictures in 1974 and later became a temporary president of Bell Records. Davies' real goal was to revitalize Columbia Pictures' music division. With a $10 million investment by CPI and a reorganization of the various Columbia Pictures legacy labels, Colpix, Cole Gems, and Bell, Davis introduced Columbia Pictures' new record division, Arista Records, in November 1974, with Davies himself owning 20% of the new venture. Columbia maintained control of the label until 1979, when it was sold to Aurelia Records. In addition, Columbia sold its music publishing business, Columbia Screen Gems, to EMI in August 1976 for $15 million. Both would later be reunited with Columbia Pictures under Sony ownership. In December 1976, Columbia Pictures acquired the arcade game company D. Gottlieb and Company for $50 million. In 1978, Begelman was suspended for having embezzled money from Columbia. Hirschfield was forced out for his refusal to reinstate him. Begelman later resigned and was replaced by Daniel Melnick in June 1978. Fay Vincent, who was hired to replace Hirschfield. Frank Price became president of production in 1978. In March 1979, he would become president of Columbia Pictures, succeeding Melnick. During Price's tenure, he was responsible for turning 9 out of the top 10 grossing films in Columbia's history. In the fall of 1978, Kirk Kerkorian, a Vegas casino mogul who also controlled Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, acquired a 5.5% stake in Columbia Pictures. He then announced on November 20th that he intended to launch a tender offer to acquire another 20% for the studio. On December 14th, a standstill agreement was reached with Columbia by promising not to go beyond 25% or seeking control for the last 3 years. On January 15, 1979, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Kerkorian to block him from holding a stake in Columbia while controlling MGM. On February 19, 1979, Columbia Pictures Television acquired Toy Productions. The production company, founded by Bud Yorkin and writers Saul Turtletab and Bernie Ornstein in 1976. In May, Kerkorian acquired an additional 214,000 shares in Columbia, raising his stake to 25%. On August 2nd, the trial began. On August 14th, the court ruled in favor for Kerkorian. In 1979, Columbia agreed with Time Life Video to release 20 titles on videocassette. 1980s, Coca-Cola, TriStar, and other acquisitions and ventures. On September 30th, 1980, Krikorian sued Columbia for ignoring shareholders' interest and violating an agreement with him. Columbia later accused him on October 2nd of scheming with Nelson Bunker Hunt to gain control of Columbia. In 1981, Krikorian sold his 25% stake in Columbia back to CPI. Columbia Pictures later acquired 81% of the Walter Reade organization, which owned 11 theaters. It purchased the remaining 19% in 1985. Around this time, the studio put Steven Spielberg's proposed follow-up to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Night Skies into Turnaround. The project eventually became the highest-grossing film of the time, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Columbia received a share of the profits of its involvement in the development. On May 17, 1982, Columbia Pictures acquired Spelling Goldberg Productions for over $40 million, with a healthier balance sheet due in large part to box office hits like Karmer vs. Karmer, Stir Crazy, The Blue Lagoon, and Stripes. Columbia was bought by beverage company The Coca-Cola Company on June 22, 1982 for $750 million. Studio head Frank Price mixed big hits like the Tootsie Gandhi, The Karate Kid, The Big Chill, and Ghostbusters with many costly flops. To share the increasing cost of film production, Coke bought in two outside investors whose earlier efforts in Hollywood had come to nothing. In early 1982, Columbia's Time Incorporation's HBO and CBS announced as a joint venture, Nova Pictures. This enterprise was to be renamed TriStar Pictures. In 1983, Price left Columbia Pictures after a dispute with Coca-Cola and went back to Universal. He was replaced by Guy McIlwain. In the early 1980s, Columbia and TriStar Pictures set up a film partnership with Delphi Film Associates and acquired an interest in various film releases. In 1984, Delphi Film Associates acquired an interest in the TriStar and Columbia film slate of 1984, which would make $60 million, offering in the financing of film production. Also that year, Columbia Pictures had bought out the rights to Hard Bodies, which was once premiered on the Playboy channel. Columbia Pictures expanded its music publishing operations in the 1980s, acquiring Big Three Publishing, the former sheet music operations of Robbins, Feast, and Miller, from MGM UA Communications Company in 1983, Baldwin Mills Publishing, and from Simon and Schuster in 1985, and Al Galacio Music in 1987. On June 18, 1985, Columbia's parent acquired Norman Lear and Jerry Perincio's Embassy Communications Incorporated, including Embassy Pictures, Embassy Television, Tandem Productions, and Embassy Home Entertainment, mostly for its library of television series such as All in the Family and The Jeffersons for $485 million. On November 16, 1985, CBS dropped out of the TriStar venture. Many changes occurred in 1986. Expanding its television franchise on May 5th, Columbia also bought Merv Griffin Enterprises, notable for Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, Dance Fever, and The Merv Griffin Show, for $250 million. Months later, on August 28th, the Columbia Pictures Television Group acquired Danny Arnold's Danny Arnold Productions Incorporated, including the rights to the sitcom Barney Miller 4D Productions, among other produced series such as Fish, The Mimus Corporation, AES Hudson Street, Tri-Semi Corporation, and Joe Bash Telegram Limited. After Arnold's dropped the federal and state lawsuits against the television studio, accusing them of antitrust violations, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Coca-Cola sold the Embassy Pictures division to Dino D. Lorenz, who later folded Embassy Pictures into Dino D. Lorenz Productions Incorporated and became D. Lorenz Entertainment Group. Coca-Cola also sold Embassy Home Entertainment to Nelson Entertainment. Coca-Cola, however, retained the Embassy Pictures name, logo, and trademark. HBO was later partnered to drop out of the TriStar venture and sold its shares to Columbia. TriStar later expanded into the television business with its new TriStar television division. The same year, Columbia recruited British producer David Putnam to head of the studio. Putnam attempted to defy Hollywood filmmaking by making smaller films instead of big tentpole productions. His criticism of American film production, in addition to the fact that the films he greenlit were mostly flops, he left Coke and Hollywood concerned. Putnam then discontinued multi-picture pacts with various filmmakers, including Norman Jules. Putnam later then discontinued multi-picture pacts with various filmmakers, including Norman Juleson, which was permitted to expire before all of the promised product could be delivered. Under Putnam's control, he set up a $270 million package of in-house pictures and acquisitions, and the average lineup of 25 features was expected to be $10.78 million, about $4 million less of the cost that Columbia before under Putnam's control. He set up a $270 million package of in-house pictures and acquisitions, and the average lineup of 25 features was expected to be $10.78 million, about $4 million less of the cost at Columbia before Putnam came on board, and a number of low-cost acquisitions such as Spike Lee's $5 million picture School Days. On October 22, 1986, Greg Cotty was appointed by Columbia Pictures as key executive of the studio to complement David Putnam's pledge on Columbia's picture to fix its sights over its international market. On December 17, 1986, the company acquired a 30% share in Roadshow Cody and Carroll, a company Greg Cody headed, and decided that they would pick up films and miniseries to put an effort to add it up to Columbia's shares, and listed dozens of seriatical and television films and dozens of miniseries throughout the edition of the Columbia slate. On June 26, 1987, Coca-Cola sold the Walter Reed organization to Cineplex Odeon Corporation. On October 14, 1987, Coca-Cola's entertainment division invested in $30 million in Castle Rock Entertainment with 5 Hollywood executives. Coke's entertainment business division owned 40% in Castle Rock, while the execs owned 60%. Columbia Pictures Entertainment era from 1987 to 1989. To volatile, business made Coke shareholders nervous, and following the critical and box office failure of Ishtar, Coke spun off its entertainment holdings on December 21, 1987, and sold it to TriStar Pictures for $3.1 billion, and TriStar Pictures Incorporated was renamed as Columbia Pictures Entertainment Incorporated. Coke spun off its entertainment holdings on December 21, 1987, and sold it to TriStar Pictures for $3.1 billion, and TriStar Pictures Incorporated was renamed as Columbia Pictures Entertainment Incorporated, CPE, with Coke owning 80% of the company. Both studios continued to produce and distribute films under their separate names. Putnam was ousted from the position after only 1 year. Putnam was succeeded by Don Steele. Other small-scale boutique entities were created. Nelson Entertainment, a joint venture with British and Canadian partners, Triumph Films, jointly owned with French studio Gaumont, and which is now a low-budget label, and Castle Rock Entertainment. On January 2, 1988, Columbia, Embassy Television, and TriStar Television were formed into the new Columbia Pictures Television, and Embassy Communications was renamed as ELP Communications. In early 1988, CPE set up a new subsidiary, Triumph Releasing Corporation, which handled administrative services related to the distribution of Columbia and TriStar's films for the North American market, while Triumph was responsible for the sales, marketing, and distribution of Columbia and TriStar Films under the direction of each individual studio internationally, with Patrick N. Williamson serving as head of Triumph. On January 16, 1988, CPE's stock fell slightly in the new market on its first day trading in the New York Stock Exchange. Coke spun off $34.1 million of its Columbia shares to its shareholders by reducing its stake in CPE from 80% to 49%. On April 13, 1988, CPE spun off TriStar Pictures Incorporated as a reformed company of the TriStar Studio. In April 1988, CPE sold its music publishing operations to the British company Filmtracks. Filmtracks was acquired by Thorn EMI in 1990. In June 1988, CPE announced the sale of Columbia Pictures Publications, consisting of the print music operations, to the investment firm Boston Ventures and was renamed CPP Bellwin. CPP Bellwin was acquired by Warner Chappell Music of Warner Bros. In 1994. On February 2, 1989, Columbia Pictures Television formed a joint venture with Norman Lear's Act 3 Communications called Act 3 Television, now Act 3 Productions, to produce television series instead of managing. And now we come to the present, which is the Sony era, which has been happening since 1989. On September 28, 1989, the Columbia Pictures empire was sold to the electronics giant Sony, one of several Japanese firms that buying American properties for the amount of $3.4 billion. The sale netted Coca-Cola a profit from its investment in the studio. Sony then hired two producers, Peter Guber and John Peters, to serve as co-heads of production when Sony also acquired the Guber-Peters Entertainment Company, the former game show production company Barris Industries Incorporated, for $200 million on September 29, 1989. Guber and Peters had just signed a long-term contract with Warner Brothers in 1989, having been with the company since 1983. Warner Bros., then a subsidiary of Warner Communications, sued Sony for $1 billion. Sony completed CPE's acquisition on November 8th, and the Guber-Peters acquisition was completed on the following day. On December 1st, 1989, Guber and Peters hired a longtime lawyer of GPEC, Alan Jew Levine, to the post of president and COO of Columbia's newly formed company, Filmed Entertainment Group FEG. FEG consisted of Columbia Pictures, TriStar Pictures, Triumph Releasing, Columbia Pictures Television Distribution, Merv Griffin Enterprises, RCA Columbia Pictures Home Video, internationally known as RCA Columbia Pictures International Video, Guber Peters Entertainment Company, and ancillary and distribution companies. 1990s. In 1990, Sony ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars, gave up a half interest on its Columbia House Records Club mall order business, and bought from Time Warner the former Metro Goldwyn-Mayer studio lot in Culver City, which Warner Communications had acquired in its takeover of Lorimar Telepictures in 1989, thus ending Burbank studio partnership. Initially renamed Columbia Studios, Sony spent $100 million to refurbish the rechursed Sony Pictures Studios lot. Guber and Peters set out to prove they were worth this fortune, but though there were to be some successes, there were also many costly flops. The same year, Frank Price was made the chairman of Columbia Pictures. His company, Price Entertainment Incorporated, which he founded in 1987, was merged with Columbia in March 1991. Price left Columbia on October 4, 1991, and was replaced by Warner Brothers executive Mark Canton, and reactivated Price Entertainment as Price Entertainment Company with a non-exclusive deal with SPE. Peters was fired by his partner Guber in 1991, but Guber later resigned in 1994 from Mandalay Entertainment for the following year. The entire operation was reorganized and renamed Sony Pictures Entertainment SPE on August 7, 1991, and that same time TriStar, which had officially lost its hyphen, relaunched its television division in October. In December 1991, SPE curated Sony Pictures Classics for Art House Fair and was headed by Michael Barker, Tom Bernard, and Maurice Bloom, who previously operated United Artists Classics and Orient Classics. Publicly humiliated, Sony suffered an enormous loss on its investment in Columbia, taking a $2.7 billion write-off. Taken off a $2.7 billion write-off in 1994, John Calley took over as SPE president in November 1996, installing Amy Pascal as Columbia Pictures president and Chris Lee as president of production at TriStar. By the next spring, the studios were clearly rebounding, setting a record pace at the box office. On December 7, 1992, Sony Pictures acquired the Barry and Enright Game Show Library. On February 21, 1994, Columbia Pictures Television and TriStar Television merged to form Columbia TriStar Television CTT, including the rights to Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, after CTT folded Merv Griffin Enterprises in June. That same year, the company also purchased Stewart Television, known for producing game shows such as Pyramid and Chain Reaction, among others. On July 21, 1995, Sony Pictures teamed up with Jim Henson Productions and created the joint venture Jim Henson Pictures. In the 1990s, Columbia announced plans for a rival James Bond franchise since they owned the rights to Casino Royale and were planning to make a third version of Thunderball with Kevin McClory, MGM, and Danjik LLC, owners of the franchise, sued Sony Pictures in 1997, with legal dispute ending 2 years later in an out-of-court settlement. Sony traded the Casino Royale rights for $10 million as well as the Spider-Man filming rights. The superhero became Columbia's most successful franchise. The first movie came out in 2002, and as of 2021, there have been 7 follow-up movies with the U.S. grosses in excess for $2.5 billion. Between the releases of the first and second sequels in 2004 and 2007, Sony led a consortium that purchased MGM, giving it distribution rights to the James Bond franchise. In 1997, Columbia Pictures ranked as the highest-grossing movie studio in the United States, with a gross of $1.256 billion. In 1998, Columbia and TriStar merged to form the Columbia TriStar Motion Picture Group, aka Columbia TriStar Pictures, through both studios still produce and distribute under their own names. Pascal retained her position as president of the newly united Columbia Pictures, while Lee became Combined Studios head of production. On December 8, 1998, Sony Pictures Entertainment relaunched the Screen Gems brand as a horror and independent film distribution company after shutting down Triumph Films. In 1999, TriStar Television was folded into CTT. 2 years later, CPT was folded into CTT as well. 2000s. In the 2000s, Sony broadened its release schedule by backing Revolution Studios, the production/distribution company headed by Joe Roth. On October 25, 2001, CTT and Columbia TriStar Television Distribution, CTTD, merged to form Columbia TriStar Domestic Television. On September 16, 2002, Columbia TriStar Domestic Television was renamed Sony Pictures Television. Also in 2002, Columbia broke the record for biggest domestic theatrical gross with a tally of $1.575 billion, coincidentally breaking its own record of $1.256 billion set in 1997, which was raised by such blockbusters such as Spider-Man, Men in Black 2, and XXX. The studio was also the most lucrative of 2004, with over